For the married among us, I would, it's always interesting to hear people's stories about how you met your spouse. How did you first, and I know some of your stories, you may know ours. I met Darlene. The very first time I met Darlene was a cold winter night. And I was doing some pastoral visitation with her sister and family. And Darlene happened to be visiting her sister and family, and we got to talking. It was a Saturday evening. The reason I know that is because Darlene and I got to talking, visiting, and her sister and brother-in-law and their family all went to bed. And here Darlene and I are still in the kitchen, still talking. And one moment I look at the clock, and it was getting to be close to midnight. And I still had about an hour drive to get back home. And finally I said to Darlene, I have to work tomorrow. I need to get going. And the rest, as they say, is history. Ruth Chapter 3 is all about not so much how Ruth and Boaz meet, because we know from last week in chapter 2 they've already met in Boaz's field. Really, it is about the strangest marriage proposal in the Bible, maybe in all of history. If you are looking for ways to ask someone to marry you, the strategy that Ruth uses will likely be at the bottom of your list. Here's what we have in the 3rd chapter of Ruth. A woman asks a man to marry her. A woman asks a man to marry. Now, I realize in our day and age that may not be as unusual, but still somewhat unusual. And he agrees. So that we'll say that's a bit unusual maybe today. But there's more. A foreigner, a Moabite, asks a Jewish man to marry her. And we've talked about, and just to remind you, that things between the Moabites and the Jews were not the best in terms of relations. So that is extremely unlikely that a Moabite and a Jew would marry. Now, if we peer a little closer, we realize that an employee asks her boss to marry her. That's a little strange. Probably has happened, but not usually. Finally, and I'm not going to take a survey here, but finally it's a younger woman who approaches an older man to ask him to marry her. At midnight, on the threshing floor. Now, today, the way that couples meet could be all sorts of ways. Frankly, today it happens often online. Maybe they're through some dating app like Match.com or eHarmony. Sometimes people are introduced by a mutual friend, or they may meet through work or church or at a party. And sometimes the way that couples meet each other is very strange. Almost it is unbelievable. And that leads us back to the story of Ruth and Boaz. And in Ruth chapter 3, the setting is Naomi has heard about Ruth's meeting with Boaz. And for Naomi, that has just turned everything around. It has reinvigorated her hope. And Naomi comes up with a brilliant but risky little plan. And it's all about ensuring Ruth's place in the family and in society. And what Naomi is actually seeking for Ruth, it's a little bit hidden in our newer translations, but what she wants for Ruth is a resting place. Now, in the NIV, which is on the screen here, it says, I must find a home for you. What Naomi literally says to Ruth is, I need to find a resting place for you. I need to find security for you. I need to find you a stable life. And in Naomi's day, and in Naomi's world, that means a husband. And since Boaz has shown Ruth great kindness, Naomi thinks maybe Boaz could be the one. But nothing about the way that Naomi goes about arranging for Ruth and Boaz to meet, we would say by modern standards, is normal. Today, Naomi or Ruth might post an ad online, says something like, widowed woman from Moab seeks godly Israelite man of character for long walks in the barley fields and quiet evenings by the fire, must like children. But 3,000 years ago, that's not how things would be done. So in chapter 3, Naomi undertakes what seems to have been part of her role as a mother-in-law in that culture, to see to the future of her son's widow. And so she instructs Ruth to bathe, to anoint her body, to change her clothing. Now, that reference to putting on clothing, in some of the translations it says Naomi tells her to put on her best clothes. I'm not sure that's really an accurate statement of what Naomi is saying. I think what Naomi is saying to Ruth is that, Ruth, it's time to take off your mourning clothes. In that culture, and in even some cultures today, when a woman is a widow, she will wear black for the rest of her life. Naomi is telling Ruth, take off your mourning clothes, put on normal clothes or regular clothing, and that indicates that your sorrow over these events that have happened with your husband, with your father-in-law, with your brother-in-law, that's past. It's time to change the clothes. And she also tells Ruth, watch carefully where Boaz goes after he's got a full stomach, after eating supper, because lots of times after I've eaten a good full meal, I sit down and I need to check for holes in my eyelids. And when Boaz lays down and he goes to sleep, Ruth needs to go over there and uncover his feet and lie down. And Naomi is confident, you're saying crazy, but Naomi is confident that Boaz will have some further instructions on what Ruth needs to do from there. This theme of establishing a woman's security through marriage, especially through marriage to a prominent and wealthy man of the community. Today, that seems rather antiquated. That makes us feel a little awkward, maybe. And certainly Ruth and Naomi stand as models for women in their bonding together and in their working on their own to secure their survival. But as we read this account, we cannot forget that their story is from a context, from a societal structure in which long-term security for women depended upon their being in relationship with some male who had access to economic assets. That's how it was in that day. And so it's no accident that in the Old Testament, over and over again, widows and orphans, along with the poor, are seen as the neediest of the needy to whom society needed to offer protection. And God judges society. In the Old Testament, he's always judging society by how they treat the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners, those in need of protection. And so it's not surprising then that Ruth cooperates with Naomi in her plan to arrange this encounter with Boaz. Now, let me say something else here. In our sex-fixated culture, the account of Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor in the middle of the night, I know you're already going there, aren't you? Our minds start going, our imaginations, our speculations. Is this a steamy encounter between mutually desiring people, like a soap opera or a romance novel? Is this what we have here? Now you're all opening your Bibles, Ruth 3. Or is this a beautiful but needy young Ruth forcing herself to relate to a rough, pot-bellied, snaggle-toothed, but rich old man for the sake of her mother-in-law? Could it be we have a clever, scheming Ruth cooperating with Naomi to compromise and force the hand of the most handsome and wealthy bachelor in Bethlehem? Let me offer you a Bible study, Bible reading tip here. It goes like this. When people are offering all sorts of interpretations of a text, it's really a good idea to really give attention to what the text itself actually says. This isn't rocket science, I know, but sometimes we read something and from our minds start going and we imagine what it's saying. And sometimes we just need to come back and say, what is actually the text saying? And in this case, there's a reticence of the text. It doesn't say a lot of what we might think it is saying. And so that leads us to be careful about supplying the additional details that simply are not there. If Naomi is really telling Ruth to look for and offer this illicit sexual encounter with Boaz, it would be, from everything we've learned to this point about Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, it would be totally shocking. And it should be, because that's not what we have learned to expect from any of these people. Boaz doesn't do what maybe everybody else. And also, let me just point out to you, if you read through Judges chapters 19, 20, and 21, you'll get a pretty good idea. Good isn't the word I want. You'll get a pretty shocking idea of just how vulnerable women were exploited and abused in the days of the judges. And so Naomi seems pretty confident Boaz isn't that kind of a person. And so when Ruth asks Boaz to spread the corner of his robe over her, it's not a sexual proposition. It's a request for marriage. And she asks him to spread the wing of his garment over her, because he was a potential kinsman redeemer. Now, back in the field, you may remember Boaz's prayer. Boaz prayed that God would take Ruth under God's wings. And now Ruth is asking Boaz to answer his own prayer for her. She's inviting Boaz to be a representative of God's loving kindness towards her. Behind Ruth's boldness is this ancient Israelite obligation. And it's a little strange to us maybe, but the obligation seems to be, and we're not totally clear. on what exactly is going on here in Ruth, but there seems to have been some sort of obligation that if a woman was widowed without sons, which is Naomi's case, her husband's brother was to marry her and to bear children with her. And those children would actually be counted as the descendants of the dead brother. Read about it in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And then it seems that a later custom developed that if there were no surviving brothers, and that's the case for Naomi and Ruth, then the nearest next of kin had a moral obligation to take in the widow. But that isn't exactly, the challenge of that isn't exactly what happens here. Because it's not Boaz and Naomi who are getting together here. It's Boaz and Ruth, the daughter-in-law. So anyways, something about kinsman redeemer, some obligation is happening here. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that we can make in Bible study is to draw the conclusion that certain individuals act in powerful ways, but they don't really know what they're doing. So sometimes you'll read commentators on this account in Ruth Chapter 3, and they'll say, you know what? Ruth misunderstood Naomi's instructions. Or Ruth misinterprets Jewish law. She was a Moabite after all. She misinterprets Jewish law, and she turns an awkward situation into an embarrassing legal predicament by confronting Boaz with another man's responsibilities. So Ruth just is all confused and just messes things up. But somehow, despite messing everything up, she still ends up marrying Boaz, and she conceives, and she saves the family line. What if this isn't a series of blunders? What if Ruth knows what she's doing? And what if Ruth deliberately alters Naomi's plans? What if Ruth is doing what we have seen Ruth do up to this point in every other occasion? She is looking for more and better ways to love Naomi. Remember that pledge in the very first chapter when they head back to Judah from Moab? Ruth says, I am with you all the way. And Ruth makes that commitment to go to a foreign land as a foreigner. And I pointed out how often Ruth is described as a Moabite. Incidentally, not in chapter 3. Naomi actually talks about Ruth and her and our family. But Ruth shows little concern about her own future, about her own happiness. Maybe Ruth here is probing the limits of what it means to live as a child of God. What if that's what Ruth is doing here? How does that change the story? And as we look at what happens in this chapter, don't forget that allegiance that Ruth swore to Naomi. And no matter what the future held for Ruth, she is not going to turn away from Naomi and start thinking about herself. Naomi can talk all she likes about finding a home or finding rest for Ruth. Ruth has already found that. She found it the day that she took refuge under God's wing. And it's from this position of rest and security in God that Ruth finds the strength and the determination and the freedom to lay down her life for Naomi. And so what we have here is not an act of mindless compliance, of Ruth just doing what Naomi tells her to do, but we have an act of wisdom. We have an act of strength, of determination. So instead of following Naomi's carefully crafted instructions to wait for Boaz to tell her what to do, Ruth changes course. And Boaz doesn't tell her what to do. She tells Boaz what to do. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer of our family. As I've already mentioned, clearly, Ruth, the woman, the younger woman, the employee, is proposing marriage here. The reference to Boaz's identity as a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer raises the subject of land, of property. And by putting both marriage and land together, Ruth makes clear that her intention is, I want to have children. I want to bear a child to inherit the land that I'm asking you, Boaz, to redeem. As I said at the very beginning, this is one marriage proposal for the books. And true to her vow, Ruth is also making an unprecedented sacrifice to rescue Naomi's family. She doesn't have to do this. And Boaz knows it, which explains Boaz's response and Boaz's words of honor and respect to her. Two cords bind Ruth and will still be wrapped firmly around her heart when her body lies silent in the grave. And she has tied these knots herself. First of all, Ruth's heart and soul, Ruth's heart and soul belongs to God. God's loving kindness flows through Ruth. And she loves God, and she loves God best by loving and sacrificing for Naomi. And in the boldest act of faith, she steps out and, undaunted by years of barrenness, she volunteers to bear a child. And Ruth sees in Naomi's suggestion a window of opportunity to do more for her mother-in-law than anyone has a right to ask for. Anyone has a right to dream. But that's characteristic. That's the way it is for someone who loves God as Ruth loves God. We are witnessing Ruth pour out herself for Naomi in a very powerful way. Ruth lays down her life for Naomi. She volunteers to conceive a child to rescue the Elimelech family from extinction. And I can't help but think of the words of Jesus spoken to another Gentile when he said, I truly tell you, I have not found in Israel anyone with such great faith. Ruth, out of her poverty, is giving away all that she has. She offers herself to save Naomi. And this is the gospel. This is how God's kingdom looks on earth. This is one of God's greatest power tools for changing human lives, for renovating this fallen planet, for putting our world right. This is the point where the kingdom of God powerfully intersects with human culture and begins to transform it from the inside out as those who follow Jesus pour out their lives for others. Jesus said, whoever wants to be my follower, to be my disciple, must deny themselves, take up their cross, follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. How different our world would be. How changed the news. How sharply abuse and violence would decline. How much more would our relationships with each other be enriched if, as the people of God, we could truly follow this call and get serious about pouring out our lives, about looking out for others, and let Jesus work through us to bring wholeness to our broken world. Paul says something similar. He addresses every believer when he exhorts us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And he doesn't leave anybody out in those words. All of us are to do that. And then he addresses in Philippians, he addresses the whole church when he writes, you need to have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had, who made himself nothing for our sakes. This radical spirit of loving kindness, of self-giving love that we see in Jesus, shone brightly in Bethlehem that night that Naomi sent Ruth to Boaz at the threshing floor. It was an act of strength, an act of sober responsibility, an act of commitment to God. It was, to echo the words of Jesus, a voluntary taking up of a cross. It was the freedom of laying down life. It was the pursuit of God's glory and the good of another. It was becoming more like Jesus. And when we do all that, women grow stronger and flourish as kingdom builders. When we do all that, children thrive and begin to realize their calling to give back. And slaves walk free in full equality with their Christian brothers who were once their masters. That's the gospel. That's God's kingdom come on earth.